I am here with nickname, and the at is handle. So this is the this is a really esoteric um, username, but and then your Substack is called Subdomain. So it's like really difficult to pin you down, very ambiguous. But we're here to have a conversation. You've written a lot about religion. You've written about Hinduism. You've written about Christianity, um, antinomianism, uh, philosophy, the tripart division or Trinitarianism in different religions, human sexuality, and you call yourself a Protestantism respecter from St. Paul to Augustine to Luther to Barth. So I'm not really familiar with Barth. Is there a particular Christian denomination that you identify with? Or could you explain a little bit about who Mr. Barth is and why is he good?
Um, yeah, so I'm not like, if someone were to meet me like in real life, I wouldn't probably appear like a normal Protestant Christian because I don't go to church and I haven't been baptized. So my relation to religion is more like when I was a teenager, I had like this really weird like experience where I felt like I got really close to becoming enlightened, and then somehow I got very afraid and ran in like the opposite direction from it, and that coincided with talking on a meditation form called the Dharma Overground, which some of your listeners may be familiar with. It's like a kind of like Daniel M. Ingram. It's like a secular form of meditation where a lot of people who had experiences of psychedelics will like try to catch up with that experience by starting a meditation program. So I didn't really believe in God initially growing up, but because I had like a certain spiritual experience before I turned 21 that matched the experience had by a woman named Bernadette Roberts, I then started to believe in God, and then I would just read about like a bunch of different religions. And throughout my 20s, I kind of identified as like a Muslim, even though I didn't practice. But up until recently, like another like kind of sort of like guilt experience I had with religion leads me more to identify with Protestantism. So the reason why I like Barth is because he doesn't. It's not like in Calvinism where like when like in Calvinism someone is saved because God makes like a choice like before time begins, like who is saved and who is not, and then Jesus is like somehow like a tertiary figure in that person's salvation. It's more like with Barth, we don't. There's no like invisible God. It's just the only God we know is like Jesus, and Jesus is like here, like the here and now appearance of Jesus is like God's definitive revelation to us, and like this idea that there's a God who's like puppeting things that doesn't exist. I just like that notion. Makes sense. Oh, you might be muted.
Sorry about that. When you say that Jesus is God and there's no puppeteer controlling things, um, like when are you referring to like the model of a clockwork universe, or are you referring to like a deistic model that God is like a necessary force that keeps everything going? Are you referring to like Calvinist ideas of pre-selection? Like, what do you mean when you make that distinction?
I was referring to like Islam. They have a philosophy called Asharism, which is like a lot of people think is like the dominant form of Islamic theology, where like they have like a model where God control. Like for them, there's no laws of physics. So if someone throws like a tennis ball, God makes the tennis ball disappear and reappear like in increments. So like God is like direct. There's direct causality over like all atoms in the universe. And he also like makes people believe or disbelieve. So that's why I don't like Islamic theology, because like if you pay very close attention, there's no explanation for anything other than pure voluntarism. So Muslims have to like pray to God every day that God doesn't make them apostatize on their deathbed and all that kind of stuff. So I dislike that because it's a very like picture book conception of God. But that's like what I mean by like the invisible God. And that's like something Luther struggled with like his whole life. He tried to reject this idea that he was unsafe because he had to focus on Jesus.
That's pretty incredible. I guess I'm not knowledgeable about Islamic theology, but that sounds like much more extreme than Calvinism, which I guess is based off this nominalist idea that, yeah, God controls everything and there's no limits on God. Um, yeah, I guess I think this also goes into questions of free will and like the independence of things. So I kind of believe that electrons have a form of free will. I think that they have degrees of freedom to make choices. We have degrees of freedom to make choices, and so I'm not really a strict determinist in that sense. And maybe I'm not philosophically. If I talk to a philosopher, he'd probably run circles around me. But maybe that's not a justified belief. But I suppose I guess I'm adverse to saying that things are random, but that things are a product of will, and that I don't know. I believe in probabilities, so I think that um, there's like probability is determined. Like when you flip a coin, the determined probability is 50%. And you can call that 50% random, but I would make a distinction between true randomness, which would be like you flip a coin and then it turns into a goose. That would be that would be pretty random. But if you flip a coin and there's a 50-50 shot of it doing one thing or another thing, I tend to distinguish randomness from probability, and I guess that's how I think about free will. There's another aspect to that, which is, like you said, that growing up, maybe you came from a secular background or an atheistic background, and you had an experience, like a personal, private experience, and that experience led you to investigate religion and to start believing in God. And I think that sort of would be, maybe that's why you were sympathetic to Islamic theology at first, because you kind of felt like you didn't really choose or rationally figure God out. God just kind of imposed divine reality upon you through this experience. So I think that's also, I don't know, I guess that sort of explains or helps me understand why people have a conception of God as a control. Like in the Bible, it says, like, you know, God hardened the heart of the Pharaoh. But we're sticking right now to just Islam and Christianity and maybe implicitly some Judaism. But you also write about Hinduism. So you know, my understanding of Hinduism is it's not just one religion. It's many different philosophies that all came out of the geographical area or the culture of India, but they're actually kind of radically different from each other. So could you kind of explain your perspective on Hinduism, and, you know, if you think there's sort of good versions and bad versions, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I used to be very partial to Hinduism because I would read like Frith Job Schwan and Rene Guénon and Louis Zivola and some of these like so-called traditional school writers. And like they are very fond of like the whole caste system idea where like they're innately people who are like Brahmins and Kshatriyas and Vaishyas and so on and so forth. And it's like the same system that Plato came up with like the uh, guardians, auxiliaries, producers, that whole thing. And so because at the time I had like this messianic fantasy where I thought I was like the Islamic Messiah or whatever, I identified myself with like a Brahmin, and I kind of use Hinduism as a kind of like, so because like a lot of like, so like in Hinduism, like there's, I guess like there are two, but I don't know if anyone actually reads the Vedas, because like in the Mahabharata, it says like the Vedas are afraid of people with like little knowledge. So it's like, and they say that if someone reads the Mahabharata, it's basically the equivalent of having read the Vedas, or somehow the Mahabharata is like a summary of the Vedas, but also has more than it. So it's like the idea that like the Vedas are actually important for like Hindu theology. I don't think that's entirely accurate, because it's like why read primary sources, that sort of thing. Um, but the thing I liked about Hinduism is mainly that like the story of the Mahabharata is just like a really crazy story that has like all these ideas. Like for them, Krishna is like not like he's an incarnation of Vishnu, but in the Mahabharata, he's basically portrayed as like God the Father as opposed to God the Son. So he's more like an incarnation of like the all powerful God as opposed to like like a somehow like a co-equal hypostasis of God. And his job is basically to depopulate the earth because the earth complains there are too many people. So the gods conspire to create like an Armageddon where they all incarnate in different family lines and start a feud that like becomes a war. And then that eventually like most of the male population on earth dies or something. So it's basically a depiction of like the end of the world. But at one point, Krishna speaks the Bhagavad Gita to Arjuna, and then that forms like a dialogue within Mahabharata. But my attraction to it was mainly because like number one, they have like Vedanta, which is like it's very like seductive looking philosophy where you kind of just have an immediate experience of God, and then the other part that I liked was like it's kind of has a lot of like crazy, wacky island stories that are like very entertaining. So it's like, yeah.
I found the Mahabharata to be very emotional. And in fact, I think Japanese mythology, modern day anime, is one to one resulting from the Mahabharata. So to me, reading the Mahabharata was like reading a really long manga. Well, that was my experience. So I was pretty into it, I was into the characters and stuff. You bring up an interesting point about the fact that there were these Vedas, and the Vedas are actually in themselves very diverse. Like if you read the Rig Veda, which like you said, nobody reads the Rig Veda, but when you read the Rig Veda, you don't come away as a world rejecting, meditating. Like the Rig Veda is like a series of college football chants. Like that, some quotes from the Rig Veda are like, and then Indra smashed his enemies with his mighty rod, and, then he drank a bunch of soma with his bros, and the Maruts, they were coming in, and they were just smashing the enemies, and, there's different parts, obviously, like Agni is celebrated as this god which can grant us wealth, and Varuna's in there, so there's a lot of different perspectives, but it's mostly seems obsessed with, it's kind of like a gangster story. It's like, I'm a gangster and I kill my enemies and I get all the cattle. I have a lot of cattle. Like the term cattle, I was really surprised because obviously in India they have a sacred status for cattle, but they talk about cattle as like the equivalent of saying like I got a lot of money in the bank. Like there's this image of cattle in a cave that they're gonna hide all the cattle in a cave, and it's almost like a bank vault. Like I'm so rich with cattle that I've just got like I've run out of room to store my cattle, and I have to like hide them underground now. So yeah, there's a lot of talk about being very wealthy, being very powerful, military victory, prosperity, economics. I mean, that's the focus. It's a very Vaishya and Kshatriya oriented text, from my opinion. There's not a lot about giving up on the world, meditating, saying, obviously the words of the Sanskrit words of the Rig Veda become mantras, but in themselves, they're not like a classical, like, I'm surrendering my life and I'm giving my life to Krishna, and I'm, like Hare Krishna is how we perceive Hinduism in the West. And they're like, okay, we don't have any possessions, we shave our head, And if you read the Bhagavad Gita, that is, to a large degree, what the Bhagavad Gita is about. It's about resist the things of the world. Don't become obsessed with fruitive desires. Don't try to accomplish anything in the world. Everything is outside of your control. Just trust in Krishna. Do the will of Krishna. And it is what you said. It's like a depopulation campaign. So it's pretty crazy. But I guess what I'm saying is that I think that even within the Vedas, there are, like if we talk about the Upanishads, in contrast to the Rig Veda, These are very different texts, and both of them precede, in my view, the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita, to me, seems much more aligned with the Upanishadic tradition, whereas the rest of the Mahabharata is much more aligned with a mixture. I mean, it's the Bhagavad Gita. You can find those lessons throughout. King Yudhishthira is constantly, he's meeting with Yama, the god of death, and he has to answer all these questions about philosophy. So the philosophy of the Bhagavad Gita is interwoven throughout the Mahabharata, but there's definitely parts of the Mahabharata where you're like, this is much more influenced or inspired by the Rig Veda than it is by the Upanishads. The way I explain that from a historical perspective is to say that the Upanishads are older than Sanskrit, and the Upanishads come from the Dravidian language and the Dravidian culture, which maybe developed in Iran 10,000 years ago, and then the Indo-Europeans came in with their Sanskrit and their different language, and they kind of fused those two religions together syncretically and came up with Hinduism, which has a lot of contradictory themes. That's kind of how, but that's more of a historical perspective than like a theological, which one is right or wrong. Like, is life about getting cattle and defeating your enemies, or is life about kind of giving up material desires and saying mantras all day? Do you have an inclination either way, or is there a third way?
That is like, okay, so that's interesting that you would mention that, like, well, because I don't know, I haven't read the Rig Veda, I'm not familiar with the Dravidian thing, but that is like, I guess that sounds like a possibly plausible explanation for why like they have a different orientation. What I would say is I would recall Kierkegaard in Fear and Trembling, where he basically says you can have both, like the rejection and the acceptance, and that would be that's like, okay, so in Fear and Trembling, like Kierkegaard's whole theme is that Abraham is giving up Isaac, but also believes that he's going to survive even though he's about to kill him or something like that. And so I kind of see the Bhagavad Gita as like in line with Kierkegaard, because Krishna is not telling Arjuna to leave the battlefield, but he's telling him to still fight, even though it necessitates killing his relatives. And he says that like even though you're going to kill your relatives, like you're still doing a good thing because you're obeying like the divine will. So it's a bit like Abraham obeying God's will. Somehow, according to Kierkegaard, he's not a murderer because he's obeying the divine imperative. And he also believes that like Isaac's gonna live. So it's this weird thing where like he gives up Isaac and takes him back. So they're like you could like, in there are verses in the Gita that like reappear because like the whole everything's like interconnected or whatever. So like there's one where like Krishna says that like even if an evildoer does my will like undividedly, he should be reckoned as righteous or something like that. And that's kind of like a recall of theological voluntarism, where like Abraham is going to do God's will to sacrifice Isaac, but he's no longer considered a murderer because he's like obeying a direct command from God. And then there's like and this is like a different theme, but like it shows like the interconnected thing where like Christian says like if you give a leaf or water as a gift, it's like good karma. And then there's like a verse in the New Testament where it's like Jesus is like, if you give a cup of water to a child, you get your reward or something like that. So there are always like these like reappearing themes and like different things. There's also a verse in the Gita that's basically like almost like the same as like the Calvinist perseverance of the saints, where it's like Arjuna asks Krishna what happens to someone who pursues enlightenment and then like falls away because like they get distracted or something. And Arjuna thinks that that person loses both this world and the next world because they like somehow failed at their spiritual goal, and they also weren't like pursuing this world at the same time, so they kind of just like are totally lost. And the metaphor he uses is like he gets scattered like a ruined cloud, and then Krishna says that like nothing happens to him, like his like he's basically preserved, and then like he has nothing bad happens to him either in this world or the next world. So there's like this idea that like say like he's fine. But yeah, I guess I don't really view the Gita as being like world rejecting, because it's basically like that whole like nishkama karma, like don't do fruit of desires, is more like do things in the world, but like somehow like not be of it or something. So I view it as kind of like a world integrating kind of like thing.
Yeah. another way to view this in historical or material terms is to say that world rejection is a form of humiliation. Now, a more accurate term in modern English would be to say it's a form of humility. I think those two terms are deeply related etymologically, but also psychologically. That to make yourself humble and to be humiliated are essentially this. It's the same psychological function. So when you have a religious text and the religious text is saying, you know what, actually it's good to be poor. Actually, the best people are, um, people who give up everything, people who do what they're told. Like if the, in the story of the Mahabharata is if you are a whatever side you're on, if you're on the good side or the bad side, they both actually have a duty. It speaks extensively about this kind of tragedy of duty that you have to do the good thing or the bad thing, but you just have to do what the state tells you to do. And Duryodhana, who is the primary enemy, beside the king Dhritarashtra, Duryodhana, in the end of the Mahabharata, ends up in heaven. He doesn't end up in the highest level of heaven, but he's chilling, like he's having a good time. So the lesson there is like it doesn't matter whether you fight for good or evil, as long as you're loyal to the state and you follow the chain of command. And that ethos seems to be inspired by the fact that India, at a certain point, had a desire to consolidate, unify, and make order its citizenry, which often came from vastly different ethnic and religious traditions. And I see Christianity, Islam, and even Judaism actually as serving similar historical functions, that you have a really complicated cultural, linguistic, ethnic zone, an empire, and you've got to somehow get all those people to unify and to not squabble with each other. And so they have to learn to love their neighbors. They have to learn to turn the other cheek. They have to learn to be a little bit humble. So that ethic, I think, is really key for the success of empires. But on the other hand, the ethic in the Rig Veda, I think, is reflective of a colonial, imperialist, warrior aristocracy, where the ethos is not to just like do whatever people tell you to do, but the ethos is like be an adventurer, be a pirate, go out, do cool things, like, defeat your enemies. We also see that in ancient Greek mythology with Odysseus as a pirate. So yeah, I think these are two different mythologies that appeal to two different types of historical situations or strategies, one of which is managerial and is just trying to calm people down and get them in line, and the other one which is more aggressive and martial and militaristic and seeks to take over existing societies rather than to chill everybody out and make people happy and cooperative. So you could say one of them is more cooperative, one of them is more competitive, and those different mythologies arise according to, I would say, religions that are inspired by a priest class that's trying to manage a population versus a warrior class that's trying to, rile up the gangsters so we can go do a drive-by, on the Ganges River sort of thing. So I don't know. I will let you know I have a short time frame today, so I just want to let you know in advance before we go long. But I still have 5 more minutes here to explore some ideas. I think this is very densely packed already. I don't know if anyone actually knows anything we're talking about, because if you haven't read these texts in advance, you might think we're just kind of spouting off nonsense. But I actually appreciate the depth of your knowledge. You have a lot more. You're much more well read on these topics than I am, but I'm trying to keep up with you.
Yeah, that's okay. So yeah, I don't that I've been thinking recently about like ethnicity and religion, because like there's the Red Scare podcaster named Anna Kachian, and she has this line that she keeps saying where it's like you can only practice the religion you're born into. And I sometimes think that's true because like I'm East Asian and born into like a nominally Christian family, and for whatever reason, like my practice is like a mix of like Buddhism and like Christianity or whatever. Even though like I was very partial to Islam in my 20s, like after I tried praying for a couple of months, like I wasn't really able to like if I were to practice Islam full time, I would have to marry outside of my ethnicity, and that kind of militates against people who say that Islam is not an ethno religion because like they always think like Islam is a universal religion, but like in practice, like it's not really the case because like I would like living in the West. There's like no East Asian Muslim environment. So, so it's like this. Uh, shit, I hadn't known that before. Yeah. Because like I'm always disappointed as like, okay, I'm Chinese. I meant yeah. Like I'm always disappointed as a Chinese person that like my people have not really contributed a lot to like religious history aside from like Taoism. But like Buddhism, like India, especially Tibetan Buddhism, which is like the most famous form of Buddhism, is mostly from like Tibet, and then everything else is like the Middle East. So I'm and I guess it's because it's like ethnically like we're kind of like materialistic pragmatists. So like we just kind of like Confucianism doesn't have a metaphysic. It's just like a social kind of thing, and that's why like we have like billions and millions of people, but it's just like no religion. So it's like somehow like there's like a thought maybe like ethnicity precedes religion, and then like maybe people have a certain like there's an ethnic personality that gives rise to like different religions or something.
That's a controversial thesis, but I think there might be something to it, depending on how we describe and understand ethnicity. Um, it's an interesting question. One of the things you said when you said that China doesn't really have a religious history endemically, it's kind of borrowing from these other religious traditions, and I mean maybe that's true to an extent. I'm generally a critic of China, so almost like I feel like this is when a black person says something a white person's not supposed to say. The white person's like, I don't know if I can say what you just said, but you said it. It's not me. But I guess one of the things I thought of was the War of the Heavenly Kingdom, and to me that's incredibly interesting. That there were these people, and I think they were majority Hakka in southern China, but they decided that they were, the brother of Jesus Christ was alive, and he was going to start this new heavenly kingdom. And I'm really disappointed that they didn't actually get to keep their heavenly kingdom, and they got crushed by, the imperial forces in a really bloody war. I mean, one of the worst wars of all time. But I would be really interested to see what that looks like. And also, I would point toward, I mean, people are very critical of Falun Gong as a religious cult. But I think it's interesting. I mean, I think there are a lot of, I mean, I guess what I'm trying to say is that maybe, I mean, we all borrow from different people. Like, obviously, if you're not Jewish and you're Christian, you're borrowing from the Jewish people. And the Jews, I think, borrowed from the Greeks and the Platonists, and they borrowed from the Zoroastrians, and everyone's borrowing. So I wouldn't encourage people to feel down on themselves because like, oh, my ethnic group didn't invent the religion that I worship. But I actually think that it's possible that there are uniquely Chinese forms of religion that could develop, and maybe they haven't so far. Maybe they've been suppressed militarily. But I don't know. I would be really interested to see, what the Heavenly Kingdom would look like, or something else. Whether it be good or bad, I don't know. I don't know the theology of those people. Maybe I would not want to join their movement. But it sounds exciting to me, and I think actually Maoism and communism, as much as we can criticize it, and fair game. Like obviously, I'm not against criticizing Maoism. But I think there was a religious quality to the belief in Mao. I mean, the deity of Mao Zedong. I mean, I've driven around with Chinese taxi drivers, and they'll have like a little medallion of Mao Zedong. And I'm like, who's that? And it's like Chairman Mao. And I'm like, okay, why do you have him? And they're like, it's good luck, And yeah, I mean, is that a superstitious belief versus a theological belief? What's the distinction there? Yeah, sure. I mean, it's fair to make that criticism. But I think that communism in China, for better or worse, has taken China from being, a sub-Saharan African country, and as far as its economic capabilities, and it's made it into potentially a global superpower. At least that's what people think. Maybe we're skeptical, but ostensibly, it's like increased its wealth exponentially. It's done a lot of these interesting things. Whether I like it or dislike it, think it's good or evil, I do think it's powerful. And for me, that's the ultimate. That's kind of an ultimate prerequisite for religion. Is that religion is a powerful tool to change the world around us, and Christianity does that, Judaism does that, and to the extent that these religions cease to be powerful is when I think they cease to be religions. So when someone tells me, well, I'm a Christian, I don't really go to church, and I don't know, I don't believe a lot of the things in the Bible or whatever, it's like, I reject that. I'm a big fan of the verse, be hot or cold, and if you're lukewarm, I spit you out of my mouth. Like, that's my opinion, is that a real religion is like the heavenly kingdom. Like, we're full gung-ho, we're true believers, and people who are like, I don't know, I kind of believe in something, maybe. I say, oh, that's fake religion, that's dying religion. So, some of the things you said, I think people might take issue with, and like having visions of God or divine revelation, and I think some people might be uncomfortable with. I have a very secular, atheistic audience, so I think a lot of people will say, oh, that's woo-woo, that's scary, or they think it's crazy, but I find it to be, I think we need stuff like that. I think we need people who are deeply committed, deeply curious, deeply interested in truth and in religion and these sorts of things. So, people are allowed to disagree, but I think that just having a worldview, like you're saying, just having a materialistic worldview of China, look, the GDP's up. Isn't that good enough for you? It's like, no, actually, human beings have deeper desires than just the GDP, and we have to address that in some way. And you're trying to do that with your Substack. I'm going about it maybe in a more subtle, implicit way. You're really just fully addressing the issue head on. So I appreciate that. I think it's brave. And I know it's a short time period today, but I think we've explored actually much more in depth than I have with anybody else. We've explored some really interesting topics that, again, you're going to have to read 1,000 pages before maybe you understand what we're talking about. Hopefully not. There's a lot of background reading. In kind of closing thoughts, I want to give you the floor to, respond to everything I said and finish up here and tell us, things you'd recommend we read, whether it's on Substack or a book or things you're working on in the future and your plans.
Okay, yeah. So this is like another like dense thing packed into a dense thing. But I guess like when trying to determine what's the difference between like a cult and religion, the criteria I use is purely historical, and it's like, did it come before or after Muhammad? And if it's after Muhammad, I generally say it's a cult. So that's like Mormonism, Scientology, Theosophical Society, like Falun Gong, Scientology, etc., etc., Baha'i Faith, that kind of thing. And anything before that is like real, and anything that's like a branch within that, like Protestantism, Catholicism, Vaishnavism, is all real because it's just from a pre-existing revelation. And the only intelligent argument against this is like when Hinduism is Islam combine streams and become like Sikhism. People are like, oh, that's a new religion. It's like, no, it's not a new religion. It's just like Muhammad's stream combining with like the Vedic stream or something like that. It's like, that's really all it is. So that's like the hacky way. I don't like saying that because people are going to convert to Islam when I say that, but like that's the argument I use in favor of Islam for like a very long time. In terms of what I recommend people read, like I have very bad anxiety, so I have like, it's hard for me to sit and read like in a dedicated manner. So I'm kind of like a kind of jack of all trades reader, but I really like Kierkegaard, and I really like Fear and Trembling. It's just a very ridiculous. I haven't even read the whole thing, but like it's just like the way he writes and some of the things he writes. It's like he doesn't write in a systematic manner, but he's kind of just like poking fun. He's probably just like making fun of people or certain ideas in the text, and what he believes exactly is like we're not entirely sure what he believes, but like he's like reductio ad absurdum at Hegel like over and over again about like like this idea that like ethics is all encompassing or something like that. And so I just think he's just a very has a very flashy style.
Awesome. Yeah, people will have to check out Kierkegaard. There's a lot of things I haven't read, so I'm not as well educated on you as you on these topics, but I'm glad we got some time to speak together. Again, I think we covered a lot more ground, and I had to listen a lot more carefully to what you were saying than if we were just talking about, I don't know, politics, cultural, current events, something like that. So I hope people could decipher some of the stuff we were saying. I hope we weren't too esoteric and crazy today. But yeah, I really appreciate you coming on, and hope we're able to speak again.
Thank you, Joko. This is so cool, and I hope we can speak again too.
Sorry, I was on mute. Okay, you gotta like, you gotta comment, you gotta subscribe. Don't have a lot of time today. Not a lot of time. But I'm always going to tell you, did I say subscribe? You're already subscribed. I mean, come on, you're watching this, you're subscribed. You didn't find this by happenstance. You're a subscriber. Okay, we already know you're a subscriber. This is a very different one. I'm trying to do more stuff on religion, philosophy, those sorts of topics, because I think I am pretty politics heavy. I'm pretty cultural heavy, current events heavy, even military analysis, right? Material stuff. But I'm trying to branch out. I'm trying to be a jack of all trades, just like our friend nickname. So I'm trying to branch out, and I'm trying to get into areas where maybe it's not my greatest strength, and maybe the audience doesn't like it. Maybe people are confused, and they're like accusing me of being schizophrenic. Fair enough. Okay, I try to bring a level-headed approach to things, but I understand. We're going in crazy directions. Maybe people don't like this episode. I know. I'm just putting out a lot of content. So if you don't like this one, that's okay, because the next thing is going to be completely different. And it's like, it's like the jelly beans. It's the variety jelly beans. You're going to like, I like the butter flavor. Maybe you like the butter flavor too. Maybe you don't. Maybe you prefer the apple flavor. Okay, but we've got all sorts of flavors. I'm putting out hundreds and hundreds, an endless stream of the most diverse, most stimulating, intellectually controversial, cuts to the core. You can feel it in your bones. This is crazy stuff. You're not going to get this anywhere else. So if you can financially support me, that helps. This is my only source of income. I've dedicated, this is a self-funded campaign to make Substack work, to make this the career for the rest of my life, however long that is. And if you guys want to help me, you financially support. If you can't financially support, it's okay. I understand. You got to feed your kids. You got kids to feed. But it doesn't cost any money to like it. Even if you hated it, you could still like it. If you like me, don't consider liking the post. Consider liking me. Okay? That's what you're doing. When you click like, you're saying you like me. Whether or not you enjoyed this particular episode, you like me. And give a comment. Tell me, do you like my hair? Do you like this hairstyle? I switch between the crazy and this is the conservative. This is the orderly hairstyle. How am I looking today? Am I looking good? Am I looking handsome? I'm feeling good. And restack, even I know a lot of you guys don't, you're not, it makes me feel good. Forget the algorithm. When someone restacks my thing, touches my heart, makes me feel like, wow, you actually read what I had to say, or you listened to the podcast and you liked it enough to give me a restack. It feels good. Twitter deboosts Substack links. So if you link me on Twitter, no one's going to see it. But you can screenshot and then you can comment below the link, if you want to do that. I don't know if any of you have popular Twitter accounts. Come on, celebrities. I've had a couple of little celebrities and they've screenshotted my Substacks, but then they don't link. They don't link my post. So they see the screenshot of my Substack, but they never end up here. So Celebrities, if you're gonna do that, make sure you link me, because we're trying to grow. We're trying to grow. We're trying to make this a self-sustaining career. Who knows? Will we make it? Will we not? That's up to you. That's up to you, dear watcher, dear listener, and dear reader. My life is in your hands. My destiny is under your control. So make your decision today, tomorrow, next week, next month. You got some time. You think about it. Sleep on it. Think about it. Get back to me on that one. Okay, hope you guys enjoyed, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. And we're going to stop recording. There we go.